Welcome to my series about traveling to Cuba in early 2018. The largest island of the Caribbean captivated my attention for quite some time thanks to its rich history and stunning nature. Even if it means that you have to sell something, do it and go see Cuba while Castro is still alive, is what my uncle, who had traveled all around the world, commented about the island. At the time, I didn't completely understand what he meant, but it became clear to me very soon after I arrived in Havana on the New Year's Eve of 2017. The largest island of the Caribbean, stunning and cheap paradise, one of the few remaining communist countries in the world. Those were just some of the descriptions and visions of Cuba I had before deciding to visit it. I saw a lot of documentaries about the stunning nature and rich history of this interesting island, which was both blessed and cursed by being so close to the United States of America. Many of my older seamen colleagues told me stories about the adventures they had while their ships were docked in Cuba. One even claimed that he paid for an evening full of good food, drinks and entertainment with nothing more than a pack of chewing gum he brought with him. However, that was in the late 80s and early 90s. Cuba, I found, was very different in many ways, and I will do my best to describe what I saw and learned during 10 very interesting days around the western part of the island. I went there with my Matea and as a part of an organized tour. There were about 20 of us from all parts of Croatia, and for all of us, beside our guide Petra, this was the first visit to Cuba. After flying into Havana's airport, which bears the name of José Martí, the revolutionary from the 19th century, we went by bus to our hotel. Hotel is located close to the city center, on the Malecon, the northern seawall. Petra warned us in advance that many things like accommodation and standards in Cuba might be different from what we expected or were used to, but most of us were unpleasantly surprised. After traveling for about 20 hours, we arrived exhausted into the hotel at 11 o'clock in the morning. We started the trip in the Middle European winter and arrived in the tropical zone. All of us were looking forward to getting our room keys so we could change into more appropriate clothes. Unfortunately, we were informed that rooms will be ready only at 4 in the afternoon. At least we could change in a storage room and went to change the currency. The Cuban economy is a weird one, and we had to adjust to a lot of stuff in the coming days. First, we learned that at the time there were two currencies in use: the main Cuban peso and Cuban convertible peso. In essence, Cubans used regular pesos and foreigners used convertible ones, or tsuts, as they were nicknamed. Before, because of the low standard of Cubans and low prices, foreigners were required to pay in US dollars and were paying several times more than the locals. For example, for the same item, locals were paying 10 pesos and tourists were paying 10 American dollars. After the US government banned that kind of usage of their currency, tsuts was introduced. One tsuts was valued as 1 American dollar and should have been, at least officially, the only legal means of payment for tourists. Also, credit cards were not accepted in the country at all. Following the explanation, we went to the exchange office at the reception to get some money so we could go and eat while we waited for our rooms. Soon we also discovered that they had just a couple of hundreds of tsuts available for all of us, and there were no other exchange offices close by. So we did our best to evenly distribute what they had among us, and went for a walk around the city. At the time, the internet was also a novelty in Cuba. It was limited to special areas where you could connect to the wireless networks. Those spots were in some of the hotels, parks, and similar public areas. Also, to connect to the internet, you had to buy a prepaid internet card which gave you an hour of internet access. Even after you managed to connect, the connection was very slow and limited. Good thing with no internet was that everybody had to pay more attention to the areas around us instead of constantly gazing at their smartphones. We had a walk to the center of the old Havana, to the Grand Teatro de la Habana. It is named after Alicia No Alonso, famous Cuban ballerina, and it also hosts ballet school. Our guide Petra took us onwards through the streets to a restaurant she knew and should be open at the time. There we learned another thing about the Cuban economy. Before, as in every true communist country, everything was government-owned. Hotels, accommodation, services, stores, restaurants, and other. Recently, they started to allow some private ownership and private businesses. That way, you had private and government-owned restaurants, for example. The one where we went to have lunch was government-owned. I must say that the quality of service leaves a lot to be desired. As they are paid either way, it seems there is no incentive for the staff, so they simply do not care about the business. When we came to the restaurant, the entrance was barricaded by a table knocked on its side. Instead of walking to the entrance and talking with us, the main waiter sent one of his youngest subordinates to speak with our guide. He then walked back to the bar and relayed our requests. Even though there were about 20 of us, they sent us away as it was supposed to open at noon in about 20 minutes. Hungry, we went for a walk and came back at 12 o'clock sharp. Still, we waited about 10 more minutes before they moved the table so we could come in and sit down. Next lesson was about Cuban cuisine. Most of it was based on rice and some skinny chicken because of the bad economic situation and difficulties with imports. That lunch cost about $12, as I recall. We had similar meals in most of the government-owned hotels and restaurants where we ate on our trips. After lunch we had free time until evening. Matea and I went for a walk around the center. We went to see the El Capitolio building, which was built by the USA while the island was still under their influence. After the revolution, Castro had emptied it as it was a symbol of imperialism. During our visit, it was being renovated again. We sat down and adorned the old American cars on the streets. Even though they immediately spring to mind when somebody mentions Cuba, from what I saw, they comprise only about 40% of cars on the street. Other 40% are Russian Ladas. Volkswagen's Beetles comprise another 10% and the rest are more modern cars. That evening was New Year's Eve and we had an organized dinner in a restaurant in the old part of Havana. Even the restaurant was called Vieja Havana or Old Havana. As it was too far away to walk, Petra gathered us in the lobby so she could organize us taxis to take us there. She negotiated with the taxi boss as the drivers didn't speak much English. We were divided into groups of 4 people per car. Matea and I boarded into the first car and soon saw that all of them were falling apart inside. The back of the seat in front of us broke at the slightest touch, and I had to hold my doors closed with my hand through the window. Our driver blasted off and we held onto the crumbling car seats. After maybe 3 intersections, he stopped, turned around and asked us, "Where are we going?" It took us a while to remember the name of the restaurant, but he had no idea where it was. We managed to find the address on one map app which was working offline. He had no idea how to get there. Then we had to find on someone else's phone where we actually were and in which direction we should be going, and we finally moved on. When we got closer, the driver slowed down so much that he was able to ask people walking down the streets, "Vieja Havana?" but unfortunately no one seemed to know about it. It wasn't promising. After about 10 minutes, the car stopped because it ran out of gas. We figured that we should be in the radius of about 500 meters, so we continued on foot. Still, that experience cost us about $20. We finally managed to get to the restaurant, which was located on the roof of a standard apartment building with an inner courtyard. In one corner there was a band playing music, and in the other was a bar, kitchen, grill, toilet. On the table a guy was mixing cocktails, and right next to it there was a big grill on which meat was cooked. In the little room to the left, the mother of the barman and the cook was washing the dishes. In the other part of that structure, a toilet was located. The dinner was self-service, plates were plastic ones, and our designated seating area was on a concrete edge around some plants. They were charging us $50 for this dinner. After the meal, we went for a walk around the rooftop and saw that they also had tables and chairs for sitting on the other sides. The best detail I saw was a dog house in between the tables where people were dining. I was even more surprised when an actual dog came out and looked at us. We decided to go back to our hotel before midnight and to see how people are celebrating the arrival of the New Year in Cuba. Petra warned us that we should be careful when walking down the streets, as it is a tradition there to pour water through the windows to wash away all the bad from the old year. On the way, we didn't see some special celebrations, and more importantly, we got back to our hotel dry and went to sleep exhausted. Next day, it was the 1st of January, and we were supposed to go and visit the house of Ernest Hemingway, which is located outside of Havana. Unfortunately, they informed us that the house is closed today and that we have a free day. It was closed because it was Liberation Day, a holiday which celebrates the revolution. It has existed since the revolution ended in 1959, and we were puzzled why they even tried to organize something on a holiday when most of the things are closed. Matea and I decided to go for a walk by the sea and towards the city center. We started following the long waterfront towards the entrance to the harbor. It overlooks the open sea and there is nothing on the other side until Florida. Weather was nice and warm and we examined the buildings in line. Very few of them were in good shape and most had plumbings and wirings installed on their fronts. At the end of the seawall there were a lot of fortresses guarding the entrance into the Havana harbor. underneath our feet was the Havana tunnel connecting both sides of the harbor. One of the forts seemed to be open and we wanted to see if there was a museum inside. The guards said that they will happily charge us the entrance tickets, but that there is nothing inside. We could just take photos from a bit higher up, as they said. We thanked them and continued down the waterfront and found a large walking area with parks. Several statues were located here, but the area in general looked in disrepair and quite dirty. There were several city sweepers here, but they were more interested in resting on the benches than in cleaning the streets. During our whole stay in Cuba, wherever we went, someone was always trying to sell us some cigars or beg something out of us. First of many examples came that morning when a young girl started talking to us in front of the entrance to the building we were passing by. She saw that we were tourists and asked if we would maybe like to buy some cigars. We were interested as we couldn't return from Cuba without some cigars. She proceeded to explain how we are very lucky, as her uncle can sell them to us with a discount and only today. Usually, she said, farmers who grow tobacco must sell it to the government, which then dictates the price. They are, however, allowed to keep a small part of tobacco and sell it themselves, but only on certain days, and we were just lucky enough that today was one of those days. Without even thinking that something bad could happen, we followed her inside the building and up the stairs. We went down the dark corridor and into an apartment on the first floor. Around that time, I started to get worried about Matea's and mine kidneys, but we entered a sales hall of some kind inside one living room. We were welcomed by a smiling guy who invited us to sit on two plastic lawn chairs. He was standing next to a kitchen counter with very fancy boxes of cigars. Behind the counter, there was his wife cooking lunch. The guy started offering us the boxes for the prices which started with several $100s. We simply did not have that kind of money with us because of the small amount of money which we were able to change in the hotel. In the end, we came down to the smallest and least fancy box, which set us back $100 for 10 cigars. He wanted to continue bargaining, but the girl brought in another couple from the streets, this time from Australia. We were happy to see someone else, paid, shook his hand and fled through the doors. My feeling of walking around Cuba on your own was that it is quite safe and you don't have to worry that you will get robbed. Tourists are very well looked after as they bring in a steady stream of foreign currency. Even if something would happen to you, it is very unlikely that it wouldn't be seen and reported to one of the many local committees for the defense of the revolution, which exists to help support local communities and report on counter-revolutionary activity. So, you are safe from illegal robbery, but legal robbery is another thing completely. We went onwards and found the presidential palace. It used to be the seat of the dictator Fulgencio Batista, who fled from here after his rule was ended by the revolutionaries led by Fidel Castro, or guerrilleros as they call themselves. Now the palace has been turned into the Museum of the Revolution. As they claim, it was left as it was at the time when the former dictator fled from it. I had the feeling it was done as Fidel Castro wanted to distance himself from such decadent capitalist buildings. The same could be said for the El Capitolio we saw the day before. Some rooms of the presidential palace were filled with artifacts from the revolution. They show the chronology of the struggle together with names and pictures of the guerrilleros who became national heroes. Exhibition continues with the successes of communism in peacetime. Progress of agriculture, electricity production, medicine, even the memorabilia of the first Cuban in space are all shown here. Unfortunately, it seems that history ends in 1990, as all the data goes only until that year. Next year, the Soviet Union collapsed. All remaining communist countries which relied heavily on the Soviet help were hit with difficult times, including Cuba. Early 90s were called the special period in Cuba, and we learned much more about it when we traveled to Varadero a few days later. Majority of the building is not in the best shape. It is obvious that some renovations were started but stopped and never resumed. Souvenir shops were also abandoned and empty, an interesting detail showing the inefficiency of those government-owned institutions. As there is no incentive, there is no effort. I am sure that shelves would be stocked if it would be privately owned. In the back of the palace, various vehicles from the time of revolution were displayed. We saw primitive tanks converted from construction vehicles, jeeps, planes, and even Granma. Granma is an old yacht which Castro and his fellow revolutionaries used to get from Mexico back to Cuba to start the revolution. In a boat designed for 12 people, 82 of Castro's most trusted comrades sailed for 10 days before reaching the shores of the island. Later, they renamed the Cuban province where they landed and also the official newspaper of the Communist Party in the honor of the boat. We continued through the streets of the old part of Havana. We found a spot where Vin Diesel's Dom meets Charlize Theron's Cypher, his future arch-nemesis in Fast and Furious 8. The movie was the first Hollywood blockbuster shot on the island since the American embargo came into effect in the 1960s. After the Cuban Revolution ended in 1959, the United States of America put the new communist Cuba under a harsh economic embargo. As of 2023, it is still in effect and therefore the longest-lasting embargo in the world. Filming of the movie was welcomed as a step towards normalization of the relations between the countries and also living conditions in Cuba. Movie's opening sequence and race were filmed around the old parts of Havana, and in a few shots we also recognized the hotel we stayed in.
Whoa, whoa. Here I come. Oh, here I come. Oh.
While continuing the walk around the old part of Havana, we saw that most of the buildings were in a very poor state. Facades were crumbling and it was questionable how structurally stable they actually were. Also, most of the wiring and plumbing seems to have been installed much after the actual construction, on the front sides of the buildings. As it was explained to us later, people usually just move into a building if they find an empty one. They can adapt it to their needs and live there rent-free, but without any guarantees or official maintenance. That way, most of Havana's slums are located in the inner parts of the city. Old Havana is inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List. We saw some buildings being rebuilt with their help. However, those works progress so slowly that while they renovate one building, the rest of the city block will crumble to the ground. Poor condition of the whole Cuban infrastructure can partially be explained with the American embargo. There are some donations made by various American and international organizations, but it seems that getting building material is quite difficult for the government, and getting money to pay for it is even harder. We finished that day of independent exploring by going for lunch in one of the restaurants we found in the old part of the city. There were several to pick from, but a sweet-talking young greeter talked us into choosing his restaurant, which was obviously the best. Coming from an over-touristic Dubrovnik, we both had experience with that kind of advertising, but we had to eat somewhere. We had some kind of stewed meat and it wasn't the best, and there was also some hair in it. But the most unpleasant surprise came when we got the bill. The charge amounted to 34 American dollars, or tsuts, and they simply rounded it up to 50. It was a mandatory tip, and luckily we had just enough money to pay it and left back to the hotel. That was the main lesson we got about legal and daylight robbery in Cuba. The main issue we had with it was that the cash we could use was quite hard to come by. The only exchange office we found was yesterday in a hotel, and they didn't restock the money today as it was a holiday. After buying those cigars and lunch, we practically didn't have anything left to buy something to drink, not to mention some souvenirs. Luckily, the situation improved in the following days.